Why the American Civil War really began. In 1861, at exactly 4:30 a.m., a single cannon shot screamed out from Fort Sumter. It didn't just mark the beginning of the American Civil War. It rang like a funeral bell for the fragile unity of a divided nation. But was that truly the first shot fired? Or was it the final echo of a country already tearing itself apart from within? The bigger question is this: why did nearly 750,000 Americans have to die in a war that, maybe, didn't need to happen? According to the latest research, the estimated death toll ranges from 620,000 to 750,000, with modern studies leaning toward the higher number. Source: America's Bloodiest Conflict, Harvard University Press, 2011. Was it about slavery, about tariffs and taxes, or was it a deeper conflict between federal power and states' rights? Or, and let's ask the uncomfortable question, was it driven by political ambition, Lincoln's ambition, or Jefferson Davis's, who once declared, "We only asked for independence, they were the ones who chose war"? You're listening to MetaFacts Legends. And in this episode, we're going to reconstruct the entire story, like a living, breathing historical documentary, based on trusted sources like Battle Cry of Freedom by James M. McPherson, A Short History of the World by H.G. Wells, and even ancient military insights that strangely still apply today, from The Art of War by Sun Tzu. Stay with me till the end, because I'm going to reveal a twist that your history textbook never told you. A secret written by hand, by Lincoln, just before he became president. Part 1A, Two Americas on the Same Map. By the mid-19th century, the United States didn't look like a unified nation. It looked more like two civilizations living under the same roof. On the map, you'd see one union, but in reality, there were two worlds, two heartbeats, two opposing dreams. In the north, factories were rising like mushrooms after the rain. The sounds of looms, blacksmith hammers, and train whistles formed a non-stop industrial symphony. Railroads crisscrossed the states, cities expanded, schools were built, immigrants from Ireland, Germany, and Scandinavia poured in, chasing the American dream. The dominant mindset in the North was progress, equality, individual freedom. They believed in law, reform, and the human ability to shape one's destiny. And most importantly, they believed slavery was a moral evil. In the South, the picture was completely different. No train whistles, no massive factories, no labor unions, no waves of immigration, just endless cotton and tobacco plantations, and millions of people bound to the soil in chains. The South wasn't rich because of machines. It was rich because of shackled hands. By 1860, America held nearly 4 million black people in slavery. That was nearly 13% of the total population and nearly 40% of the South's population. They had no right to read, no right to marry, no right to keep their children from being sold. And under the law, they were considered movable property. Northerners saw this and felt outrage. Southerners looked back and felt pride. Southern Senator James Hammond once stood in Congress and declared, "Cotton is king. Without slavery, there is no cotton, and without cotton, there is no South." This was no longer a debate about economics. It had become a war of belief at the root of identity. One side believed all men were created equal. The other believed that a stable society required a hierarchy, with slavery as its foundation. One side read The Liberator, discussing philosophy and morality. The other read the Southern Review, defending the slave civilization as a superior model. People in the North asked, how can a nation praise freedom while keeping millions in bondage? Southerners responded, how dare Northerners tell us how to live? Picture this, a Northerner visiting Charleston. He sees black men in chains, being auctioned in public. He's shocked, horrified, but the seller smirks. This is New York, friend. This is the South. One country, one constitution, one flag, but two worlds. And no one knew that just a few years later, Those two worlds would collide in fire and blood. Part 1b: The Ideological Divide and a Political Spark. If you think America was divided only over slavery, think again. Slavery was just the surface, the tip of an iceberg made of deeper ideological fault lines. Beneath it lay the real question: who held the power, the federal government or the states? Was the Constitution a binding promise or a flexible agreement? The North believed in a strong central government, one that could hold the nation together. The South believed, we joined this union voluntarily, and we can leave it the same way. In other words, the North saw America as a family, you might argue, but you don't just walk away. The South saw America as a contract. If it no longer serves you, you tear it up. Between 1820 and 1850, Congress passed a series of compromises, hoping to keep the peace. But in reality, those compromises were nothing more than duct tape over a widening crack. And then, in 1854, one law came along and tore that crack wide open. The Kansas-Nebraska Act. Sounds boring, right? Just another legislative file. But its consequences, they lit the first real fuse of the Civil War. Back in 1820, the Missouri Compromise had banned slavery in most western territories north of latitude 36 degrees 30 feet. But the Kansas-Nebraska Act repealed that. It let the people in each new territory vote to decide whether slavery would be allowed. It sounded democratic, but in practice, both sides flooded into Kansas, armed, not with ballots, but with rifles. Kansas became a battleground. The press began calling it Bleeding Kansas, a land meant for farming now soaked in blood. An anti-slavery man named John Brown took things into his own hands. One night, he and his sons entered the homes of 5 pro-slavery settlers and killed them with swords, not because they attacked anyone, but because they stood on the wrong side. From a single piece of legislation, America crossed a line, the line where dialogue ends and violence begins, where both sides realized all compromise is dead and the guns were starting to load. You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where history is not just told, but brought to life. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, hit subscribe, because in the next part, we'll meet a tall, awkward man in a black stovepipe hat, Abraham Lincoln, a man half the country would hail as a savior, and the other half would curse as a traitor. Part 2a: The Death of Compromise. The year is 1854, and America feels like an antique vase, cracked from the inside. From afar, it still looks whole, but one wrong touch, and it shatters. Every election, every session in Congress, every newspaper headline whispers the same question, but no one dares to answer it aloud. Can this country still hold together? Or have the differences in faith, economy, and morality grown too wide to heal? And then came a man, Stephen A. Douglas, senator from Illinois, brilliant, charismatic, ambitious, a man who knew if he wanted the presidency, he needed a national victory, and that victory came in the form of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. On paper, it sounded like just another bureaucratic adjustment, but in reality, it wiped out the Missouri Compromise of 1820, a deal that had kept America from civil war for over 30 years. The Missouri Compromise had drawn a clear line. Slavery was banned in all territories north of the 36 degrees 30 feet latitude. It was a quiet understanding: the North would grow free, the South could keep slavery, as long as no one crossed the line. Stephen Douglas erased that line, and in its place, he offered a new idea: popular sovereignty. Let the settlers in each new territory vote and decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. He said, "I'm not here to judge right or wrong. I'm here to defend choice." Sounds democratic, doesn't it? Sounds neutral. But what Douglas really did was drop a political bomb right into America's heart. The South celebrated. They saw in this bill a way to expand slavery westward, to Kansas, Colorado, California, anywhere, really. The North, furious. Newspapers called it a betrayal of the sacred promise of 1820. Anti-slavery groups exploded in number. Emotions boiled. Prayer meetings became protests. Churches turned into pulpits for fiery speeches. And then, something happened that no one expected. Kansas became a battlefield. Thousands of people, from both north and south, poured into the unformed territory. But they didn't bring plows or seeds. They brought ballots, bullets, and burning hatred. Northerners came to save the land from slavery. Southerners came to defend the right to choose. And when they met, they didn't talk, they shot. Two rival governments were formed inside Kansas. Both claimed legitimacy, both drafted their own constitutions, and both prepared for war. The press gave this chaos a name: Bleeding Kansas, not just because of elections, but because blood was now soaking American soil. And in the midst of this chaos, one man stepped out of the shadows, a man who believed God himself had chosen him to destroy the sin called slavery. His name was John Brown, and what he brought wasn't a speech. It was a broadsword, nearly a meter long. Next, we follow him into the first holy war ever fought on American ground. Not on a battlefield, but in a shack under the Kansas moon, where the line between angel and monster begins to blur. Part 2b, John Brown and the First Bloodbath in Kansas, extended version. While the nation debated laws, delivered speeches, printed leaflets, and passed resolutions, John Brown chose the sword. He wasn't a politician. He didn't represent a party. He had no voters, no podium, no stage, just a fire in his eyes, a white beard stiff with purpose, and an unshakable belief: if blood is the price to end slavery, then let it start with mine. Brown was the father of 20 children, a failed tanner, a devout Puritan who believed every word of the Bible was God's command, and that the rule, "Thou shalt not kill," didn't apply to those who upheld slavery. As the compromise collapsed and Kansas descended into chaos, Brown didn't condemn, he didn't protest, he planned. May 24th, 1856, no drums, no flags, no declarations, just a still, moonless night along the Pottawatomie Creek in eastern Kansas. Brown, 4 of his sons, and 2 close followers, quietly left camp, carrying a list of 5 names. Cold, heavy broadswords, and the belief that death was the only fitting punishment for pro-slavery men. Their targets were not criminals, not plantation owners, just ordinary citizens who had dared to speak in favor of slavery. In the dead of night, they knocked on doors, no shouting, no threats, just questions, confirming names, then striking. One man was dragged from his bed, another was cut down in front of his wife and children, a third begged for mercy and met a blade to the chest, not with guns, with swords, because bullets were too quick. Fear needed time to sink in. To Brown, this wasn't murder, it was testimony for justice. He believed that if America still hesitated, it needed a shock, a nightmare so visceral, no one could look away. The news exploded across the country in hours. Gruesome descriptions covered the front pages. Killed in their sleep, no one spared, a holy war has begun. The North was stunned, they hated slavery. But was this the right way? If justice demands blood, is it still justice? The South didn't hesitate. To them, John Brown was a mad butcher, proof that the North would not stop until the Southern way of life was burned to ash. But in the black community, whispers turned to thunder. At last, someone is killing for us. In the wake of Pottawatomie, Kansas descended into full-blown chaos. Guerrilla bands formed, farms were raided, homes were torched, granaries looted, a war without a name, without rules, without end. By the end of 1856, over 200 people had died in politically charged violence. No formal declarations, no battle lines, no flags, just fire in the fields, and the deafening silence of a federal government afraid to act. And John Brown, he vanished into the woods. No trial, no arrest, only a chilling quote left behind. I do not regret it. I only regret not killing enough to end slavery. If you think John Brown's story ends in Kansas, you're in for a surprise. Because 3 years later, he would return, not to strike in the dark, but to declare war on the United States government itself. Next episode, Harper's Ferry, when one man declared war on America. Part 3A, The Election That Broke America. The year is 1860. The United States stands, not on solid ground, but on a fault line. Tension cracks beneath every city, every courthouse, every family dinner table. To the outside world, America still looks like a nation. But if you look closer, you'll see what Lincoln saw. A house divided against itself cannot stand. And this house was about to catch fire. In the North, industrial growth, abolitionist newspapers, waves of immigrants, and swelling cities. People debated politics in taverns and lecture halls. They talked of free labor, railroads, tariffs, and the moral horror of slavery. In the South, cotton was king. Plantation elites ruled both land and law. Slavery wasn't just an institution, it was an identity. One side believed America's future depended on progress. The other believed survival meant preserving the past. And in the middle of this chasm came a presidential election unlike any before. 4 candidates, one country on edge. Stephen A. Douglas, the little giant, architect of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, still clinging to the dream of popular sovereignty, though the blood in Kansas said otherwise. John Breckinridge, the sitting vice president, backed by the Deep South. He didn't just support slavery, he vowed to protect it everywhere, by force if needed. John Bell, the voice of neutrality from the Constitutional Union Party. His entire platform could be summed up as, "Please, let's not fight." And finally, a lanky lawyer from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln wasn't supposed to win. He was a long shot. He had only served 1 term in Congress, a decade earlier. He had no military rank, no plantation, no high office. His voice was high-pitched, his face angular and awkward. Eastern elites mocked him as backwards and provincial. But Lincoln had something none of the others did. He understood the storm, while other candidates courted voters. Lincoln spoke to their conscience. He didn't dodge the moral question, he stared it down. During the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he said plainly, "I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free." He didn't say it with fury. He said it with certainty, like gravity, like prophecy. To many in the North, Lincoln became a reluctant hero, a man who spoke softly, but carried the full weight of American ideals. To the South, he was a nightmare, not because of what he had done, but because of what he might do. Southern newspapers painted him as a radical tyrant in disguise. Some said he would free the slaves overnight. Others claimed he would arm them. One headline screamed, "Elect Lincoln," and you'll see the South soaked in blood. Panic spread through the plantations. Militias began drilling. Governors whispered of leaving the Union before Lincoln could even step foot in the White House. And yet, Lincoln kept his message calm, almost surgical. "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery where it exists. I simply believe it must not be allowed to spread." That single sentence split the country in two. To abolitionists, it was too soft. To the South, it was an existential threat. And so, on November 6, 1860, America cast its vote. Lincoln won, without a single electoral vote from the South. Not one. In 10 southern states, his name didn't even appear on the ballot. And yet, with only 39.8% of the popular vote, Abraham Lincoln became the 16th President of the United States. He had not yet taken office. He had given no executive order. He hadn't touched a single law. But to millions of Southerners, his very existence in the White House was a declaration of war. And what followed was not negotiation, not protest. It was secession. In Part 3B, we'll witness how state after state broke away from the Union, like bones snapping from a spine, and how Lincoln, still weeks away from inauguration, stood frozen at the edge of a country falling to pieces. Part 3b. The Union splinters. Before Abraham Lincoln even took the oath of office, America began to split like dry timber. One spark, one election, that's all it took. And within weeks, the United States of America became not so united. December 20th, 1860, in Columbia, South Carolina, the state legislature met in emergency session. No hand-wringing, no compromises, just one vote, 169-0. Unanimous. South Carolina was leaving the Union. Their declaration read like a breakup letter soaked in gasoline. A geographical line has been drawn across the Union, and we must act to preserve our institutions. By institutions, they meant slavery, and the dam broke. January 9th, Mississippi secedes. January 10th, Florida. January 11th, Alabama. January 19th, Georgia. January 26th, Louisiana. February 1st, Texas. 6 more in just 6 weeks. Like dominoes crashing through the Deep South. Every departure wasn't just a legal act. It was a slice out of the American map. The stars on the flag no longer matched the reality on the ground. In Montgomery, Alabama, the 7 states met, not to negotiate, but to build a new nation. They wrote a constitution, nearly word for word identical to the US Constitution. Except for one clause, no law shall ever be passed to impair the right of property in Negro slaves. They weren't hiding it. They didn't use euphemisms. This new confederacy was built on slavery, declared proudly and openly. They needed a leader, someone with military experience and political savvy. And so they chose Jefferson Davis, a former US Senator, a former Secretary of War, a man who once swore to uphold the Constitution of the United States, now chosen to lead a rebellion against it. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., Abraham Lincoln watched the Union unravel. But he said almost nothing. Why? Because he wasn't president yet. He had no power, no cabinet, no authority, just a train ticket to a job that no longer made sense. He told one friend, "If I go down, I want it written on my tombstone. Here lies the man who tried to save the Union and didn't." In the North, confusion reigned. Some abolitionists urged Lincoln to act, send troops, defend the forts, show strength. Others warned, "Let them go. We don't need war over cotton and pride." Businessmen worried about southern markets. Families worried about sons marching to their deaths. The press printed maps showing the disunited states of America. Meanwhile, tensions escalated in Charleston Harbor. There, Fort Sumter, still under US control, was surrounded by Confederate militias. Supplies were dwindling. Every day, it felt like a noose tightening. But Lincoln couldn't act yet. His presidency hadn't begun. Then came March 4th, 1861, Inauguration Day. The capital city was a fortress. Troops lined the streets. Rooftops were manned by sharpshooters. Snipers scanned the crowd for assassins. It was the most dangerous transfer of power in American history. Lincoln stepped to the east portico of the Capitol, a building still under construction. The unfinished dome above his head seemed to mirror the country itself, incomplete, uncertain, at risk. He placed his hand on the Bible, took the oath, and faced a nation splintering before his eyes. His inaugural address was a plea and a warning all in one. The Union is much older than the Constitution. It was formed before it, by the Articles of Association in 1774. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. He ended with hope, but hope, by then, felt like a paper shield. Because behind the words, the facts remained. 7 states had seceded, a new government had formed. Forts had been seized, and the next move would come not from Congress, but from the mouth of a cannon. In Part 4, that cannon will fire. 4:30 a.m., April 12, 1861, Fort Sumter will fall, and the United States will enter the darkest chapter in its history. A war between brothers over freedom. survival, and the soul of the Republic. Part 4A. The First Shot. April 12, 1861. Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The world still sleeps, but history doesn't wait for dawn. At 4:30 a.m., a single mortar shell is launched from Fort Johnson. It arcs across the darkness, a silent whisper that breaks into a scream, and crashes into the walls of Fort Sumter. That sound is not just gunpowder. It is the death knell of compromise, the echo of 30 years of political failure, the beginning of America's bloodiest war. Fort Sumter, a five-sided stone fort perched on an island in Charleston Harbor, was built to defend the nation. Now it would be the place where the nation attacks itself. Inside the fort, Major Robert Anderson, a quiet, disciplined officer from Kentucky, commanded just 85 Union soldiers. No reinforcements, no food shipments in weeks, no way out. Outside the fort, P.G.T. Beauregard, a former student of Anderson at West Point, now commander of the Confederate batteries that surrounded him. Student and teacher, now enemy and target, Beauregard had sent an ultimatum the night before: surrender by dawn or face bombardment. Anderson did not surrender. His response was simple: I have the honor to acknowledge the receipt of your communication, and to inform you that I shall await the first shot. That shot, from Confederate Captain George S. James, pierced more than brick and stone. It ripped through the last thread of the Union. The bombardment began in coordinated fury. From forts, batteries, and floating platforms, Confederate forces unleashed a hellstorm. Over 3.00 shells would be fired in the next 34 hours. The sky turned from black to orange, lit by muzzle flashes. Charleston residents climbed rooftops to watch the siege unfold like a 4th of July parade. For many in the South, this wasn't war, it was celebration. Anderson's men, low on gunpowder, lacking proper fuses, using cloth sacks as cartridges, fired back with outdated cannons, but they were hopelessly outmatched. Barracks caught fire, the walls trembled, the flagpole was shattered, and yet, incredibly, not a single soldier died during the bombardment. But this was not mercy, this was symbolism. The South didn't want blood, not yet. They wanted to prove a point. We can take a fort, we can fire the first shot, and we will not be ignored. On the second day, flames engulfed the interior of the fort. Ammunition stores threatened to explode. The men inside, choking on smoke, exhausted and half-starved, knew they could not hold. At 2:30 p.m. on April 13th, Major Anderson struck the colors. The United States flag, torn, burned, and bullet-ridden, was lowered in silence. The South had won the first battle, but it had no idea. It had just started the war. When word of Fort Sumter's fall reached Washington, President Lincoln, in office for just over a month, stood at the crossroads of destiny. He had spent weeks trying to hold the Union together without firing a shot. He had written cautious letters, made careful appointments, and urged patience. But now, the South had drawn first blood. On April 15, 1861, Lincoln issued a presidential proclamation: I call forth the militia of the several states of the Union, to the aggregate number of 75,000, to suppress said combinations, and to cause the laws to be duly executed. It was a call to arms, not for conquest, but for survival. The reaction came fast. Virginia, home to George Washington, the cradle of the Revolution, refused to send troops to fight fellow Southerners. Instead, Virginia seceded, followed by Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. In a single week, 4 more states tore away from the Union. What began as a rebellion of 7 became a revolution of 11. The Confederacy was now complete. The flag changed, the maps changed, even the capital shifted from Montgomery to Richmond, Virginia, just 100 miles from Washington, D.C. It was no longer a political crisis. It was war, and the enemy was now next door. But Lincoln didn't panic. He didn't threaten. He didn't rage. He acted. He ordered troops to be raised. He called Congress into emergency session. He promised the nation, "The Union is unbroken, and I shall preserve, protect, and defend it." Across the North, enlistment offices overflowed. Farm boys and factory workers lined up to fight, not for glory, but for country. Posters read, to arms, the Union must be preserved." Songs were written, church bells rang, flags were hoisted in every city. The nation had been asleep. Now it was awake and marching. But the South was just as ready. Jefferson Davis, now President of the Confederacy, called up his own army. He framed the coming conflict not as rebellion, but as resistance to tyranny. "All we ask is to be let alone." But the time for being left alone had passed. What neither side knew was how long this war would last, or how much it would cost. They still spoke of one great battle to end it all. But what lay ahead was 4 years of blood, fire, disease, starvation, heartbreak, and death. And it all began here, with a single flash of light, over Charleston Harbor. In Part 4B, we step into Lincoln's White House in the hours after Fort Sumter. How he wrestled with the weight of history, how his inner circle fractured, and how he chose not just to preserve the Union, but to transform it. Part 4B, Lincoln's Inner War, From Silence to Steel. April 14th, 1861, Washington, D.C. The cannons at Fort Sumter have gone quiet. But inside the White House, Abraham Lincoln is fighting a different kind of war. Not with muskets, not with cannons, but with doubt, silence, and the weight of a fractured nation on his shoulders. For weeks, Lincoln had hoped, prayed, that war could be avoided. He had sent food to Fort Sumter, not weapons. He believed that Southern anger, though fierce, might burn itself out. He told a friend, "If I can save the Union without firing a shot, I will do it." But now, that hope lay in ashes at the bottom of Charleston Harbor. Inside the White House, Lincoln barely slept. He paced the floor of the East Room. Letters flooded in from governors, generals, editors, some praising restraint, others demanding blood. He read them all, alone, in silence. His cabinet was divided. Secretary of State William Seward urged caution, "Let tempers cool." He said, Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase, a radical abolitionist, urged a swift strike, send troops, crush rebellion. General Winfield Scott, old, overweight, barely mobile, offered outdated strategies and begged for more time. But time was a luxury Lincoln no longer had. The Union Army was in shambles. Only about 16,000 men served full-time, scattered across the frontier, guarding forts in Utah and California. Many officers were Southerners, and some had already resigned. The federal treasury was nearly empty. The Navy had just 90 ships, many of them unseaworthy. Washington itself was barely defended. And yet, Lincoln knew one truth: if he did not act now, there might be no Union left to save. On April 15th, just 48 hours after Fort Sumter, Lincoln made his move. With a calm hand and a weary pen, he signed a proclamation, "Now, therefore, I, Abraham Lincoln, to call forth the militia of the several states to the number of 75,000, to suppress said combinations, and to cause the laws to be duly executed." It was the first wartime order from the President of the United States. But it wasn't a declaration of war, not legally. Why? Because Lincoln didn't recognize the Confederacy as a separate nation. To him, they weren't a foreign power, they were rebels, and he would not give the cause the dignity of legitimacy. That distinction mattered, politically and historically. It meant that the North was not fighting a war of conquest. It was fighting to preserve the Union. And Lincoln, he wasn't leading an army into the South. He was restoring law and order within his own country. But the South didn't see it that way. When Lincoln's call for troops reached Virginia, they were asked to send soldiers to fight against fellow Southerners. Their response: "No, we will not raise our swords against our brothers." Virginia seceded the next day. And so, the map changed again. Arkansas, gone. Tennessee, gone. North Carolina, gone. The Confederacy now stretched from Texas to Virginia. Its armies swelling, its cities mobilizing, its cause declared. Meanwhile, in Washington, Lincoln stood almost alone. He had no blueprint, no precedent. The Constitution did not explain what to do when half the country leaves. And yet, in his stillness, Lincoln hardened. He did not rage. He did not break. He focused. He wrote dozens of letters, quietly forming a war cabinet. He summoned Congress into emergency session. He ordered the Navy to blockade southern ports, cutting off trade and starving the Confederacy of income and supplies. It was a bold move, one that pushed the line between president and monarch. Critics called it illegal, some called it tyranny, but Lincoln didn't flinch. "My oath is to the Constitution," he said, "and the Constitution does not require me to let it die." Across the North, recruitment exploded. Volunteers signed up in droves. Farmers, lawyers, blacksmiths, professors, ordinary men with extraordinary courage. In New York, crowds cheered outside enlistment offices. In Boston, 1,000 men signed up in one day. In Ohio, boys too young to shave begged to carry rifles. The North wasn't just answering Lincoln's call, it was becoming an army. But this wasn't just Lincoln's war anymore. It was America's, and Lincoln knew the cost would be higher than anyone imagined. He began writing speeches not to declare victory, but to prepare the people for sacrifice, for years of blood, of heartbreak, of national transformation. He said, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. We must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country." This wasn't the Lincoln of paintings and pennies. Not yet. This was a man newly baptized by crisis, turning from lawyer to commander, from philosopher to fighter. He would hold the Union together, or be buried with it. And so began the true war presidency. With no plan, no roadmap, and no margin for error. The battles would come soon. But Lincoln's war had already begun. In Part 5, we follow the opening campaigns, the rush to raise armies, the chaos of the first real battle at Bull Run, and the terrifying realization that this war would not end in months, but in years soaked in blood. Part 5A, The Road to Bull Run. Spring, 1861. The drums of war are beating now, not in metaphor, but in every street of the North and South. Marching boots echo off cobblestone. Trumpets blare from courthouse steps. America is no longer holding its breath. It's holding its rifle. After Fort Sumter fell, Lincoln's call for 75.00 volunteers sparked a firestorm. In the North, boys lied about their age to enlist. Farmers left their fields mid-planting. Blacksmiths dropped their hammers and took up arms. It wasn't just patriotism. It was adrenaline, rage, pride wrapped in a blue uniform. They thought they'd be home by Christmas. The Union wasn't ready for war. The army was tiny, just 16.00 men, scattered across the frontier, and most of the best generals. They had already resigned and joined the Confederacy. Men like Robert E. Lee, whom Lincoln personally offered command of the Union Army, only to be politely, solemnly refused. Lee said, "I cannot raise my hand against my birthplace, my home, my children." And with that, he walked out of Washington and into the Confederate ranks. The new Union Army was a patchwork of militias, weekend warriors, and idealists. They wore mismatched uniforms, carried whatever rifles they could find, drilled in muddy fields and back alleys. Few had ever fired a weapon in anger. One colonel wrote, "I had men who'd never seen a horse before, now assigned to cavalry." But none of that mattered, because the newspapers screamed, to Richmond, crush the rebels in one bold stroke." Politicians demanded action, the public demanded blood, and Lincoln, under immense pressure, gave the order, advance. The target, a small railway junction in Virginia, near a lazy creek called Bull Run. The Confederate Army was camped there, protecting the path to Richmond, the rebel capital. Union General Irvin McDowell led the attack. He begged for more time to train his men. Lincoln replied, "You are green. It is true, but they are green also. You are all green alike." So, with just 35,000 troops, McDowell marched out of Washington. Spectators followed behind in carriages, bringing picnic baskets and opera glasses. Some senators came to watch, expecting an easy Union victory. They were about to witness a nightmare. On the other side of the lines, Confederate Generals Beauregard and Joseph E. Johnston prepared the defense. Their forces were smaller, around 22,000 at first, but they had better knowledge of the terrain, and thanks to the Manassas Junction Railway, they could move reinforcements faster than the Union realized. July 21, 1861, the first major battle of the Civil War begins. At dawn, Union troops begin a flanking maneuver, crossing streams, climbing ridges, pushing into Confederate lines. For the first few hours, it works. The Union pushes the rebels back. The crowd of Northern spectators begins to cheer. One congressman shouts, "We'll be in Richmond within a week." But the South isn't done. By midday, fresh Confederate reinforcements arrive by train, and in the center of the Southern line stands a Virginian brigade, led by a quiet, devout general named Thomas Jonathan Jackson. As the Confederate line begins to waver, another general points at Jackson and yells, "There stands Jackson, like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians." The nickname sticks. From that moment on, history knows him as Stonewall Jackson. And the Confederates rally. They counterattack hard. The Union line bends, then it breaks. Chaos erupts. Union soldiers, many untrained, begin to flee. Spectators run for their lives. Caught in the stampede, horses panic, wagons overturn, rifles are dropped in the mud. It is not a retreat. It is a rout. One soldier wrote later, "It was not a battle. It was a panic. We ran like sheep." Night falls. The Union Army, once so confident, limps back to Washington. Shaken, exhausted, humiliated. The first battle of the Civil War has ended in disaster for the North. But worse than defeat is realization. This war would not be quick, not easy, not glorious. The South would fight, and fight hard. And Lincoln, sitting in his study that night, is said to have whispered, "They're in earnest down there. We are going to have to spend time and blood to win this thing." In Part 5b, we explore what happens next, how the North rethinks everything, how the South rides a wave of overconfidence, and how both sides start to dig in for a war neither truly understands. The honeymoon is over. Now comes the reckoning. Part 5b, The Long War begins. July 22, 1861, Washington, D.C., the morning after Bull Run. The air is thick with smoke and silence. Soldiers limp through the streets. Muddy, bloody, broken. Officers bark orders no one follows. Wounded men lay in doorways and alleys, waiting for help that won't come. It's not the capital of a victorious republic. It's a city that just stared into the abyss, and realized the abyss is staring back. The newspapers call it a disaster. Cartoonists sketch Union troops dropping rifles and running. Public confidence collapses overnight. One headline reads, "The North slapped in the face, and it burned." In the South, celebration, church bells, torchlit parades, champagne flowed in Richmond like it was Independence Day. Confederate leaders declare, "One Southern man is worth 5 Yankees." They believe the war is nearly won. And that is the most dangerous lie of all. What neither side realizes is that Bull Run is not a climax. It's not even a turning point. It's an introduction to a war that will consume a generation. Lincoln returns to his desk. He doesn't cry, doesn't curse, but the lines on his face deepen. He writes a letter to Congress. The reality dawns upon us, even more darkly, that we are in the midst of a great struggle, and that delay only deepens the danger. He begins preparing the country for a long, bloody road ahead. First, rebuild the army. The day after Bull Run, tens of thousands of new enlistments flood into northern recruiting stations. Some out of patriotism, some out of shame, some simply because they know now. This isn't a game. Congress authorizes 500,000 troops. 500,000 men in blue. Most of them volunteers. Most of them with no idea what lies ahead. Second, find a new general. Enter George B. McClellan, just 34 years old, a West Point graduate, brilliant engineer, charming, eloquent, ambitious. He takes command of the Army of the Potomac, the new main force of the Union, and immediately begins reshaping it into a professional war machine. He drills his men daily, demands sharp uniforms, clean camps, strict discipline. He writes, "I can make this army look magnificent, and when the time comes, it shall strike like thunder." Lincoln is impressed at first. McClellan is popular, especially with the troops. They call him Little Mac. He poses for photographers, rides among the ranks, kisses babies. He knows how to build an army. But what Lincoln doesn't know yet is that McClellan has no idea how to use it. Across the lines, the Confederacy reorganizes too. Jefferson Davis expands his cabinet, calls for nationwide conscription, begins printing Confederate currency. Factories in Richmond and Atlanta work day and night making rifles, uniforms, powder. Southern women begin sewing bees. Children recite Confederate songs. But the South's biggest resource is land, and the belief that time is on their side. All we have to do is survive. One Southern editor writes, "Eventually, they'll get tired of burying their dead." In the North, the opposite lesson takes hold. Lincoln now knows that partial measures won't work. This will not be solved with one battle, one army, or one season. The North must mobilize its industry, its people, and its soul. The railroads are nationalized, factories retooled for war, farmers are offered bonuses to grow grain for troops. Even poetry changes. Walt Whitman begins writing verses not of love, but of limbs and death. And slowly, painfully, a new national psychology forms. This will not be a quick war, but it will be a necessary one. Still, doubt lingers. The South controls thousands of square miles. The Union Navy is stretched thin, and slavery, the issue that started it all, remains untouched. Lincoln knows that declaring the war a crusade against slavery could cost him the support of key states. So for now, he says, "My paramount object is to save the Union, not to destroy slavery." But deep down, he knows that one cannot be done without the other. Both sides dig in, literally. The first trenches are dug in Virginia. Blockades tighten along the coast. Raids begin in border states. Missouri descends into guerrilla war. Kentucky teeters on a knife's edge. The nation's blood has only just begun to spill. In the distance, thunder rolls. But it's not a storm. It's the rumble of thousands of boots, the crack of musket drills, the roar of foundries forging iron for guns, rails, and warships. America is becoming something it has never been before, a nation at total war. The nation's blood has only just begun to spill. But before we cross rivers and raise armies, before Grant takes command and the world changes forever, there's one last question we have to answer. Who really fired the first shot? Because while the cannons at Fort Sumter made the war official, the real trigger was pulled days earlier, in two minds, two strategies, and one brilliant trap. The twist: WHO really fired the first shot. So here we are. Fort Sumter has fallen. The war is now real. Flags are raised. Men are bleeding. The nation is split. But we need to ask the question one last time. Who truly started the Civil War? Was it the Confederacy, who opened fire first? Was it Lincoln, who sent that supply ship? Or was it something more deliberate? Let's rewind the clock, not to the cannon blast in Charleston Harbor, but to 1 week earlier. In the quiet chambers of the White House, Lincoln had a choice. After the Deep South seceded, Fort Sumter was surrounded. Major Anderson was stranded. Supplies were low. The men were starving. To save the fort, Lincoln had to act. His generals offered three options: surrender the fort and appear weak, reinforce it with troops and guns, and risk starting a war. Do nothing and hope the South backed down. Lincoln chose none of them. He did something far more brilliant and far more dangerous. He sent a ship, not with soldiers, not with cannons, but with food. It was a calculated move. If the Confederacy allowed the ship through, it meant accepting that the United States government still held power over Southern soil, that the flag flying over Fort Sumter was still legitimate. But if they fired on the ship, then they, not Lincoln, would become the aggressors. They would start the war. It was a trap, elegant, legal, lethal. Even Jefferson Davis saw it. The Confederate president gathered his advisors and said, if we permit him to supply the fort, the existence of the Confederacy becomes a sham. In other words, if they let the ship dock, the Confederacy dies without a fight. So Davis made his own decision: order the bombardment. Now think about that. Jefferson Davis didn't fire on Fort Sumter to win the war. He did it to prove that the Confederacy was real, to validate secession, to assert sovereignty, to draw a line in blood. But Lincoln, he knew all of this. He wasn't surprised when the cannons opened fire. In fact, he may have counted on it. In the memoirs of Napoleon, there's a chilling line: the wise commander never fires the first shot. He arranges the battlefield so that his enemy has no choice but to pull the trigger. Lincoln had read those words. He studied military strategy. He understood perception, law, and momentum. So instead of attacking the South, he made the South attack him. It was psychological judo, political chess. He didn't break the Constitution. He didn't look like the aggressor. But in one brilliant move, he forced the Confederacy to start a war it could never win diplomatically. And from that moment on, Lincoln had the moral high ground. The Union had the legal authority, and the North had its reason to fight. And Davis, he played right into Lincoln's hands. He thought he was defending Southern independence, but instead, he gave Lincoln the one thing he lacked: a national casus belli. So let's ask again, who really fired the first shot? On paper, the Confederacy. In strategy, maybe not. Some historians argue Lincoln provoked the South deliberately. Others call it a necessary act of statecraft. Some say it was inevitable either way. But here's what we know. Lincoln didn't start the war with gunpowder. He started it with a message. A message wrapped in bread and rice, delivered by ship, sailing straight into a trap. And that is how America exploded. Not because of one bullet, but because of a brilliant silence. Because of a president who understood. Sometimes the strongest move is to wait for the enemy to flinch. Final chapter, Legacy and Lessons. 620,000, or maybe 750,000. That's the estimate now, not just numbers. These were lives, sons, fathers, brothers, lovers, teachers, bakers, poets, a generation torn apart, not by plague, nor by famine, but by each other. No foreign invader ever set foot on American soil during the Civil War. No foreign army dropped bombs or sent fleets. This was a war entirely self-inflicted. The Civil War didn't start overnight. It didn't erupt simply because of slavery, or tariffs, or states' rights. It started because of something deeper, more human, and more terrifying: identity. The North and South weren't just disagreeing over policy. They were speaking two different moral languages. One side believed that liberty meant freedom for all. The other believed liberty meant freedom from interference. One side saw slavery as sin. The other saw it as economic necessity, or worse, a positive good. The Constitution, for all its brilliance, had left too many questions unanswered. And every time those questions came up, the country chose compromise, until compromise became impossible, until even food sent to starving men could start a war. In 1861, America stood in front of a mirror and didn't recognize itself, so it tried to destroy its reflection. History doesn't repeat, Mark Twain may or may not have said. but it sure does rhyme. And you can hear those rhymes today. In every debate that turns into division. In every shout louder than a whisper. In every refusal to see your opponent as a human being. Because the Civil War didn't just kill people. It set a precedent that when the center collapses, violence fills the vacuum. Abraham Lincoln, once a country lawyer, once mocked as a rail splitter, now stood as the man trying to hold a broken nation together with his bare hands. He knew war was coming. He knew lives would be lost. And yet, he also knew something else. That sometimes, the price of peace is injustice prolonged. Jefferson Davis wasn't a monster either. He believed in his cause. He feared the collapse of Southern culture, of tradition, of control. He believed that secession was a right, that Lincoln was the tyrant, that the Confederacy was not rebellion, but self-defense. And that's what makes this war so haunting. There were no walks, no Nazis, no distant evil empire, just Americans looking at each other and seeing enemies. And what of those enslaved? 4 million black men, women, and children watched as the white North and white South fought over their future. Without ever inviting them into the room. They weren't soldiers yet, weren't citizens yet, weren't even people under the law. But they were watching, waiting, praying that this war, so bloody, so senseless, might somehow become a door to something better. And eventually, it did. But not yet. The war would drag on. Through Antietam, through Gettysburg, through Sherman's march to the sea. Cities would burn, families would shatter, presidents would fall. But it all began because two sides refused to see each other as part of the same country anymore. That's the real lesson. It's not about cannons, or cavalry, or flags. It's about what happens when a society loses the ability to say, "We disagree, but we still belong to each other." It's about what happens when truth becomes tribal, when history becomes a weapon, when politics becomes war by other means, until war becomes politics by other means. So here we are, more than 160 years later, still arguing over what the Civil War meant, still debating who fired the first shot, still wrestling with the ghosts of Fort Sumter. And maybe that's why we must keep telling this story, not to glorify it, not to relive it, but to understand it, to learn what we didn't learn the first time, to catch ourselves before history rhymes again. Because the next Civil War won't be blue versus gray. It won't have bayonets and cannons. It might not even have a battlefield. But it will start the same way, with pride, fear, and silence. So tell this story, talk about it, share it, disagree about it. Because as long as we're still talking, we're not shooting. If you thought this story was wild, wait until you hear the ones history tried to erase. Next time on MetaFacts Legends, a 17-year-old girl who smuggled Union plans under her curls while sipping tea with Confederate officers. A man born in chains who stole a warship and later helped write laws in Congress. A Southern widow who put on a uniform, changed her name, and fought her way through 5 battles without being caught. They weren't presidents, they weren't in the textbooks, but their stories, more explosive than anything you've ever heard in school. And we're just getting started, because hidden in thousands of pages of forgotten letters, trial transcripts, and wartime diaries are stories of bravery, betrayal, espionage, and revenge that almost never made it into the history books. We dug through official archives. We used real military records, family letters, and eyewitness accounts. So if you want the side of history no one told you in class, the one with spies, cross-dressers, runaway slaves turned generals, and teenage girls who fooled the FBI of their time. Subscribe now, because next time, we don't just ask, what happened? We ask, who got left out, and why?